Welcome to Beneath the Bible, where we're helping you dig deeper and uncover the world beneath the sacred book. Today we're going to take another look at a specific artifact, the Taanach cult stand. Now, this is a truly fascinating artifact that has multiple plausible interpretations with clear and direct bearing on our understanding of Israelite religious practices. First, we're going to talk about what a cult stand actually is. Then we'll look at some of the context for this specific cult stand. Finally, we'll look at this artifact and its interpretation in depth, along with its implications for our understanding of Israelite worship. Let's dig in.
What archaeologists call cult stands is a general category of artifacts that are small, portable stands. They're a single category of artifacts only in the sense that they and their use pattern is not exactly clear, so they are cultic stands. They've been found from Egypt to Mesopotamia in periods from the Chalcolithic through the Iron Age. They were particularly popular, though, in the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. This Taanach cult stand was dated to the 10th century or Early Iron Age by its excavator. Most cult stands, particularly from this period, have a cylindrical or cone-shaped base with a bowl on top. Another popular type was shaped like a house, sometimes with multiple stories, and usually there was a place on the second or third level to place an offering bowl. During the early Iron Age, stands were sometimes painted. These types are typically found on the coastal plain and in northern valleys, for example at Kasila and at Megiddo. And other types were not painted, but had incised or relief-type decorations instead of paint. And these are typically found in the hill country, such as at Ai and Bet Sha'an. For a long time, scholars thought these were incense stands. They found burn marks on some of the bowls associated with the stands or on the tops of the stands themselves, so this isn't a bad assumption. But not all of these stands have burn marks, and some of these stands seem to have been containers for holding things. Scholars now think these stands were used not only for burning incense, but also for things like libation offerings, grain offerings, agricultural stands for vegetation rites, and some seem to have been used as cosmetic burners, not for burning incense in cultic settings, but for perfuming women or perfuming clothes. There may even have been stands for cult images, basically where you could put a small statue. There's some evidence that these stands may have been used on roofs in domestic cult rituals. You can see that this diversity of uses means that these cult stands defy simple understanding and interpretation. Each one has to be evaluated in the context in which it was found, and with that in mind, let's look specifically at the site of Taanach to understand the context for this Taanach cult stand.
The site where this cult stand was found is called Taanach. Its modern-day location is in the very north of the West Bank. It sits in the Jezreel Valley just a bit south of the site of Megiddo. The site is first mentioned in the historical record in a relief of Thutmose III at Karnak. In the Bible, it first shows up as a city whose king was defeated by Joshua. It was first allotted to the tribes of Issachar and Asher, but later to Manasseh. The Bible indicates that the city was still Canaanite during the period of the Judges, but by the time of Deborah and Barak, it was under the influence of Israel. It was the site where Deborah and Barak fought against the Canaanite general Sisera. The archaeological site was excavated in the early 20th century by Ernest Sellin and then in the 1960s by Paul Lapp. The site revealed about a dozen cuneiform tablets from the late Bronze Age. Architectural remains went back to the early Bronze Age and up to the Abbasid period. And we're going to focus on the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age remains. The site was a modest-sized settlement in the late Bronze Age. It suffered some destruction in the early 12th century. The 11th century settlement was somewhat modest, but grew in the 10th century. The pharaoh Shishak destroyed the city around 918 BC. Sealed in this destruction was a large structure related to cultic activity. There were 9 iron knife blades, 140 pig knuckle bones, which were used for divination, 80 restorable pottery vessels, grinding and food preparation implements, loom weights, 3 stela, and a figurine mold. Finally, in a cistern nearby was a cult stand, not far from where another cult stand had been found by Ernst Sellins in the early 20th century.
The stand found in the cistern, or the second stand found at the site, is 54 centimeters high and is divided into 4 separate registers. It's actually fairly unique among cult stands of the 10th century. The whole item is red slipped, meaning that after the stand was made, it was decorated with a red tinted slip or clay and water slurry that was very popular in the Iron I and Early Iron II period. But it's not painted. This style of finish is not uncommon for 10th century ceramic, but what makes this stand so important is the relief style decoration. Each register has relief style decorations, and scholars differ in how the iconography is best interpreted. The only way to sort it out and understand the strengths and weaknesses of the interpretations is to examine the imagery. We'll start at the bottom, which is also called the fourth register. This is the shortest register, as a single nude female figure taking up the majority of the center. Her arms are outstretched, and she is holding the ears of two lions. The lions are facing forward, their mouths are open, and they have a very aggressive expression. The lion sides are visible on the sides of the stand. Moving upward, the third register has two winged composite creatures, or sphinxes, flanking an intentionally blank center. Why was the center left blank? And we'll get to that in just a minute. The second register has two lions, similar in design and stance to those on the bottom. The center of the register has a stylized tree with three volutes representing branches, and it is flanked by two rampant caprids. The top register has the appearance of a voluted capital with smaller petaled capitals beneath it. In between the volutes is a single young animal. This is most likely a young bull. We know it's young because it does not have horns, though it is possible this is meant to be a horse. Above this creature is a winged disc with indications of light radiating from it. On the sides, not visible in this image, are two winged sphinxes like those on the second register.
Okay, that was the easy part. Now, what does all of it mean? What are these images meant to communicate? There are several different interpretations which are most frequently cited. Some say there are multiple deities depicted here. Others say there is only one deity depicted. Still others say that this is a depiction of sacred space.
First, there's the interpretation that this stand depicts several different deities, at least two, possibly more. The naked female figure has archaeological parallels with Astarte, whose cult was popular around the time of the construction of this stand. She has also been identified with Asherah. The tree here is widely regarded as a symbol of Asherah, and the animal in the first register is either a horse or a bull, and sometimes linked with a male deity like Baal. The addition of the solar disk on the creature, the way that deities are sometimes shown above their attribute animals, suggests this creature may be the attribute animal of the deity represented by the solar disk, perhaps Yahweh. This panel, the one with nothing in the center, is often cited as a representation of Yahweh. Yahweh is referred to in Isaiah as Yahweh of hosts who dwells between the cherubim. So this is often seen as the first representation of Yahweh. And if that's true, it's an early attestation of the aniconic nature of Yahwism, or the prohibition of depicting Yahweh visually.
But there are issues with this interpretation. First, it's impossible to know if the people who made this stand intended for this panel to be left blank, and if they did, whether that blank was meant to represent the invisible God who stands between the cherubim. It's also not clear what creature is depicted in the first register, so building an interpretation that relies on a solid identification of that creature isn't going to make the strongest argument.
Other scholars have suggested this is not depicting multiple gods, but one goddess, either Asherah or Astarte. The tree flanked by caprids is again widely regarded as a symbol of Asherah, and the naked female figure, though, is more closely linked iconographically with Astarte. The link with lions is again more closely aligned with the iconography of Astarte than with Asherah, despite the widespread citation that Asherah is called Lion Lady in Ugaritic literature. Now, Astarte is often associated with the horse in her iconography, which may be represented at the top. Beck, who has studied the stands from Taanach, has demonstrated that the iconography and style on this stand is more closely linked with contemporary Syria and Anatolia within a local Canaanite or Israelite ideational framework. Based on his analysis of the various images and parallels from Syria, suggests this stand was devoted to the weather god, depicted as a solar disk at the top.
But we think these interpretations neglect to discuss the third register, whatever's going on there, and link the solar disk, along with the column volutes at the top, with a deity in light of relevant parallels.
Another option is to understand this stand as a kind of temple in microcosm. This is based on the understanding that each register represents a temple scene, and that one moves from the bottom to the top, from profane space to the more sacred space. The volutes at the top are clearly architectural elements. We've recovered these kinds of voluted capitals as architectural pieces in excavations. Syrian and Mesopotamian temples have orthostats that are intricately carved, often with protective figures that function as aperture guardians of the sacred space within. Lions functioned as protective forces in Egypt and Mesopotamia. We have magnificent temples of stone lions that protected temples. But it was not just lions who protected temples. Composite creatures, sphinxes and cherubim, also guarded entryways, particularly at temples. The Assyrian Lamassu sculptures are a well-known example of this idea, even if they're not the closest parallels for this cult stand. Several temples in Syria in the early Iron Age have such composite creatures carved into the stones around the entrance to the temple as well.
If the artwork on the cult stand is meant to ascend from profane to sacred space, the figurine in the fourth register may be a female worshiper, though the identification with the deity is admittedly more likely. The lions may be representations of apotropaic orthostat guardian sculptures, protecting the entrance to the sacred space in the upper registers. Moving further into the temple toward the more sacred space at the top, we see the lions are replaced by composite creatures, clearly supernatural in character, and more closely situated to the divine. The third register, then, may be understood as the actual entrance of the shrine. In the second register is the tree with caprids and 2 lions.
We know that ancient Near Eastern temples and palaces were often planted with trees and sacred groves. In the so-called investiture scene from Mari, we see something similar schematically to the Taanach stand. There are 3 registers that are widely regarded as representing actual architectural spaces in the structure represented in this scene. Alongside it are trees. Trees are associated with temples and palaces and other artistic representations as well. But this is no ordinary tree. It's clearly linked with a goddess, as this motif is elsewhere clearly associated with a goddess, likely Asherah. What is in the second panel then may be a depiction of an actual tree or an Asherah pole in a temple. We've moved into the sacred precinct after the third register and are now in the core of the temple where there's a sacred tree or an implement of goddess worship that is in the sacred precinct of the temple. That leaves the first register, where the holiest place is, representing where the primary deity resides, and so is represented in the first register. Whatever deity this is, it seems to me that it is represented by the solar disk, and that the creature is functioning more as an attribute animal for the deity. So, which deity is it? Is this how early Israelites worshipped Yahweh?
So, what do we make of this artifact, and what, if any, importance does this have for the Bible and understanding Israelite Yahwism? Well, before we can answer those questions, there are several other things to consider. First, was Taanach an Israelite site? That is, were there Israelites living and worshiping at the site when this cult stand was in use? The evidence indicates the site was at least under the influence of the Israelites, but that doesn't mean that it was populated by Israelites. So, this may not have any direct bearing on actual Israelite practice.
But determining the ethnic composition of a site is notoriously difficult, particularly in this time period. You really wouldn't believe how many oceans of ink have been spilled on Iron 1 Israelite ethnic identification, and that's something we are not going to wade into right now.
So, this cult stand may not be related to Israelite practice at all. But for the moment, we want to operate under the assumption that it is indicative of Israelite worship in the 10th century. So, if that's the case, what can we learn? Well, I think there are a few interesting takeaways, regardless of which interpretive framework you adhere to. First, this is likely a depiction of syncretistic worship. Unless all the imagery here is linked to one deity, with the leading candidates being Asherah or Astarte, then it seems that multiple deities are represented here. As we've seen, it's a stretch to make everything here link with either one of these deities, so syncretism seems to be most likely.
What I think is most likely is this cult stand was used to worship a male deity who is represented at the top. It was either a storm god or a god with solar attributes. The top register is the most important, and the motif of a deity over an attribute animal is well attested, so I think this is what is being represented. Likewise, I'm partial to the understanding that this is a schematic representation of a temple, whether real or idealized, dedicated to this male deity. But the iconography doesn't make it clear which deity that is.
But sticking with our assumption that this is indicative of Israelite practices or attitudes, which deity could this be? Could it be Baal or El? Well, perhaps, but El is typically associated with the bull, not with a calf. There is precedent for Baal being linked with the horse, but there is less iconographic evidence linking either Baal or El with the solar disk. At the same time, both calf and bull imagery are linked with Yahwism, though perhaps not Orthodox Yahwism, in the Bible. The same is true for horse imagery and solar imagery. First, the solar imagery. Yahweh is called a sun and shield in Psalm 84. Psalm 104, which extols Yahweh as creator, has strong parallels with the Egyptian hymn of Aten, Aten being the solar disk. Psalm 19 has strong solar imagery and language attributed to Yahweh as well.
As for the calf or bull imagery, we see Hosea mocking the northern kingdom of Israel for trembling before a calf idol at Bethel. Calf idols were erected by Jeroboam at Bethel and Dan, and it's notable that these were not bulls, but calves. Most famously, there's the creation of the golden calf as an image of Yahweh in Exodus 32, which has a lot of parallels with Jeroboam's idolatry in 1 Kings 12. These are images of Yahweh, the God who took the people of Israel out of Egypt, either depicted as a calf or at the very least associated with a calf. And as for horse imagery, we see in the Psalms a number of places where Yahweh is described as riding, presumably on a horse. This would mean the solar disk representing Yahweh is riding on the horse beneath it in the top register, though, as we've said, it seems more likely that this creature is a young bull or a young calf. Whatever your interpretation, there's a reasonable link between this creature and Yahweh imagery attested in the Bible. Add to this the second panel being either the entrance of a temple or a depiction of Yahweh enthroned between the cherubim, and there is a strong case to be made that this cult stand was used in the veneration of Yahweh.
The Taanach cult stand is a good reminder that the prescriptions on Yahwistic worship that are preserved in the Old Testament came after a long and varied tradition of Yahwistic worship practices. And here we may have a crystallized picture of an early stage of that development. Now, we've explored syncretism and the development of Yahwistic worship in several other videos. Perhaps the best example is our video on Asherah, which you can check out here. The conclusion we've come to is this. We shouldn't be surprised to find evidence of diverse imagery and cultic practices in Israel's early history, even though the Bible itself condemns these as idolatry and heterodoxy. These laws and condemnations must have been in response to what was actually happening in Israel, both in formal or organized worship and in everyday veneration in the Israelites' homes and communities. Now, this doesn't mean that these practices were condoned or that we should find them acceptable or correct. It just means that this was the reality of worship in ancient Israel. The Bible itself attests to this, so it makes sense that we would find archaeological evidence of it as well. Artifacts like the Taanach cult stand defy easy interpretation, and they speak to the complex realities of religious life in the ancient world. Many cultic practices were not so much about what's right as about what works. Theological developments and ideas of orthodoxy and heterodoxy came later. If you believed that worshiping a jumble of deities or borrowing imagery from other gods and applying it to your god helped you to have a good harvest or protected your family from disaster, well, that was reason enough to do it. Now, again, we aren't saying that this was the right or best approach, but it's simply the way things worked. More complete understandings of who God is came later, but artifacts like the Taanach cult stand provide a fascinating window into how we got there. Thanks for joining us for this Beneath the Bible video. If you liked what you saw, be sure to give this video a like and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. You can also follow us on social media, on Twitter and Facebook at Beneath the Bible. If you learned something new today, take a minute to share this video with your friends. And until next time, keep digging.